Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me at the conference. I'm presenting the designed and the ad hoc dynamic remakings of street space in New York City. And I dedicate my presentation to my teacher and mentor, Leslie J. Lasky, who was approaching 100 years. Architect and teacher Ben Jacks has been writing about walking projects, and he has said, how do we know and position ourselves within cities? How do we lay claim to belonging in complex urban landscapes? Professor Stavros Stavridis writes in his book, Towards the City of Thresholds, that spatiotemporal thresholds would be the places where identities may open in acts of negotiating encounters with otherness. The project I speak of today deals with the current phenomenon of the pandemic, but beyond this condition, and therefore it is not finished. It's concerned with the notion of temporary versus permanent and how this affects our use of space and our mindset. And it asks how the pandemic changed our notions and conceptions of freedom on the streets. Within this project, I am considering what I call one's own or our own interiority. This means to form and understand something called urban interiority. My research often involves analyzing street culture and change in international settings, particularly in Turkey. Working here in New York, and more specifically in Brooklyn, in the time of the pandemic has been enlightening. As I work through notions of permanence and the transient, I look for ways to understand urban freedoms or the right to the city, a term social geographer David Harvey put forth as an extension of Henri Lefebvre's work. Urbanist and prolific author Richard Sennett's writing in his book Building and Dwelling states, to define the city and urban behaviors associated, he uses the French terms, and he writes that they distinguished between the physical place of the city and how people felt about it. The referred to the overall city, whereas cité designated a particular place. Sometime in the 16th century, he writes, the cité became to mean the character of life in a neighborhood, the feelings people harbored about neighbors and strangers and attachments to place. Therefore, cité can refer to a kind of consciousness. Today, we have less distinction in using the word city, but it can mean so many things. I find that with the research I'm doing on the streets of Brooklyn right now, I have tried to distinguish many ways in which we move through the city, and especially the streets and the street spaces. My focus is on how to understand the city as a series of both distinct and overlapped, collaged or blurred spaces with their boundaries and edges. I also call this urban interiorism. In the case of this fieldwork, and the theoretical research, I am working through a small paradox, which is trying to capture the not static, but rather dynamic of the city. I try to capture people's choices related to how they act in the streets. I try to understand where they go and what they choose to do and how they are contained or bounded in their activities as they walk, talk, sense, and pass. I try to capture people's beliefs, not just actions, especially in this COVID and post-COVID era. To do this, I look to not only Sennett, who also starts to outline a series of urban public freedoms associated with moving inside of and adapting to city conditions and habituating themselves, but also to the early phenomenological work of Guy Debord, who worked with the notions of psychogeography and methods to actively draw and sense the city. The exploration, he wrote, of a fixed spatial field entails establishing bases and calculating directions of penetration. It is here that the study of maps comes in ordinary ones, and as well ecological and psychogeographical ones, along with their correction and improvement. In a sense, this is the kind of work that I am doing, and I am also working through notions of the flaneur, or in my case, the flaneuse, the person who walks the cities anonymously, becoming social observers and critics, as Walter Benjamin has written about in Paris. And in this way, the remaking of the city, even in daily terms, as people pass through it, making noise, adding color or not, become very evident. My current wow in this work is that I get to also see and feel this, and importantly share in the new with my informants. I must thank the willingness of all of the informants, the people that I surveyed and interviewed, as you'll hear a little bit about. The work was palpable and continues to be inspiring. I want to be clear that I am not only speaking of preserving what is going on in the city right now or being nostalgic in this work. I, on purpose, as you can see, have read interdisciplinarily as I map and survey. I use photography, I use writing in order to convey stories and to analyze. In a related AIA New York City lecture that took place on the 7th of June, which is well after I started this project, David Rockwell and the designer and educator and thinker Bruce Mao spoke about radical ideas associated with the notion of audience and theater in the city. They discussed the first notion about audience is that they act as a kind of a community. An audience is not just about one-on-one relationships with someone and content. The user can be instead a kind of a collective or part of a collective experience that resonates by being with people, being with other people. And this very much is what is happening in the city right now. And every business and every institution, every organization is trying to figure out what the story is in this new world. So I'm going to skip now in order to talk about a little bit of the ad hoc and the defined or the undefined mess that we see on the streets. I find this actually is also, though it is various signs of warnings and perhaps disorganized barriers, odd safety measures, and many things that are mashed up on the sidewalk, that there in some ways, this also explains a kind of a joy. The odd conditions that we see with the safety barriers, street signs and solar collectors, electrical cords, city bikes and lanes that are all interrupting each other and are intermixed with the new eating sheds. We also have bubbles that have appeared weighed down by water containers and filled with sand so they don't blow away. It is indeed a time that is dynamic and unfigured out. And I think we can revel in that kind of joy. The field work that I'm involved in for this paper concentrates on two types of street conditions. I am using the notion of the word cluster and line to talk about the different kinds of food services that exist, and I am comparing them as the city would call it with the open street system and looking at Vanderbilt Avenue as a comparator. I zeroed in on my neighborhood and the surrounding zone of Clinton Hill, which is surrounded by Bedford-Stuyvesant, Fort Greene, and then Prospect Heights. In these interviews, I spoke with managers and owners, 5 of which were men, 2 were women. The ages run from the late 20s, mid 30s, early 50s through into the early 60s. People have been in their businesses since only 1 year to over 25 years. The cluster that I have put together is an area that is in Fort Greene that is edging into more of the downtown area of the city. It's right on the edge of BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music. I looked at Peaches, Baba Cool, and Moe's. You can see the Peaches is right here, Baba Cool is right here, and Moe's is here at the end of the block. Um, Peaches is the only group that actually decided to work with a prefab system. In asking all of the informants and in these interviews, I asked if they thought they were doing their own thing, part of their own part of this kind of movement, or if this was strictly about codes and survival. And everybody responded that, of course, it was about survival, but it was also about an idea of putting forth their own mission and re-understanding their vision. In other words, remaking the way that they thought of themselves on the streets. So they were very much interested in making a kind of a village. They actually worked with these prefab ideas that were bought from Home Depot. They're actually greenhouses, 4x4 and 4x6. They were able to be very efficient in the way that they were using social distancing and allowing people to sit singularly or in small groups. And they used an atomizer and projected a notion and reality of being COVID-free in order to clean each place through a technical low-tech setup that was quite effective. And the effect was striking. It's also striking at night. Baba Cool, right around the corner, could also have used this area that was on Fowler Square, but chose to actually use the side street instead. And they built their own kind of container that started to speak to the kind of what I would call conviviality of Baba Cool and the way that they work and consider their menu. Meanwhile, the owner of Moe's, which is a local bar that has been there for 20 years, the owner decided that he would work through a very different way of building his street annexes, and they're still naming them. They have the look of transport and have an artistic touch to them as well. His idea was to invite different people in that normally would maybe not come to the bar, and so far it's working. The line is actually along Green Avenue, and Green Avenue is a very beautiful place, and it passes through in the area that I chose to work from Clinton Hill into Bedford-Stuyvesant, and shows quite a diverse use of these kinds of street invitations. And the way that I'm going to talk about this is to also speak about the idea of asking about a descriptor that had to do with how people see the environment and the atmosphere that they're actually in right now. So what a lot of people were interested in was trying to describe what this new street world is about. And I asked if it was chill or calm, like a beach, like a park, like a vacation. Was it chaotic? Was it safe? Was it inspiring or annoying? Is it like a village? Does it let me see people differently? Is it unsafe? Does it make me feel the city differently? Is it optimistic? Is it confusing? Does it make me change my point of view, or were there other options? And many people wrote about and spoke about many of these ideas. The idea of like a village and optimistic and inspiring were the most selected. And this goes also for the pedestrian use that you'll see right after the line. Other people definitely said that it made them see the city differently. It was very calm. Everybody felt safe. And at times it felt like a park, certainly because of you're sitting amidst the trees. And everybody felt that they were also seeing people differently and even speaking to strangers. So what we're looking at right now is the side area, the street seats of For All Things Good. And I think that you'll see that each one of these has its own personality. And as I was saying, this is on purpose. This is part of the new mission that everybody was seeing as a positive addition to their businesses and able for them to rethink the way that they worked. This is Clementine's Terrace. They are dividing subtly between colors, between the different establishments that they have for a bakery and for kitchen sundries. This is Speedy Romeo using a separated series of little rooms wrapping around their corner, quite striking and quite in keeping with the interior, which is rather dark and industrial. This was an automotive plant to begin with, so they were keeping a low-keyed palette. This is in contrast to Izzy Rose that named their construction on the street the Pink House. It's a very casual spot with low tables that are movable with seats and little stools. And finally, we have Aita's gazebos, both attached to the front facade and wrapping the corner. This is a remembrance by the owner, who is from northern Italy. It recalls the notion of the chalet, as well as a mashup with the American interior diner. So I'm going to jump now to the Avenue. And the Avenue gave me a way of looking at the open streets movement, which is pedestrian. I was interested in only looking at the way the pedestrians are being, what I would say, showing their freedoms to the city and to each other. The city is allowing for this to happen on Friday afternoons, all of Saturday and Sunday. And it's one of the most remarkable and unusual, I would say, places that I have been able to be a part of in this time period. There is what I would say a kind of an authenticity for how people are adopting to take over different parts of the avenue, its medians, its streets, and the sidewalks. They are working to move and recline and bike all around the establishments that may also have sheds for the restaurants, but I'm looking at and speaking with the people who are coming to the street and finding their own way to work and to be with each other. So this zone stretches from Atlantic Avenue down to what is called Park Place, which you'll see down here. When one is here, there are a series of different side and crossing streets where you negotiate between various barriers and cones that are set up by an organization. And then you start to see the personality and how people are using the street. I find this a quote, authentic use. Anything goes and anything is accepted. There's no tourism yet. There's no art opening. Once in a while, there's a DJ, but it's not considered necessarily a branded pop-up. The spaces are thus free. They are especially for people to exhibit, I find, themselves. And as you can see, people are negotiating, walking around, and then lying in the middle of the street. Why wouldn't you lie in the middle of the street if you could? I've seen this several times. I've seen this way where people are unafraid to do things that you would normally never do or even touch. It's about spectatorship. It's about audience. It's about playing hopscotch, gathering, throwing a ball. It's about people meeting other people. It's taking your table to the street. It's being spontaneous. It's kids coming up to people who are not their parents, people reading, and people just relaxing and celebrating that they can be out and they can use the street in these various and unusual ways. It's camping out, it's relaxing, it's taking your kids to a place, it's meeting people from other parts of the city and inviting them to come here. This was part of the conversation with everybody I met and everybody that I spoke to. So what's next? It's not exactly a conclusion. It's something that I think needs to be considered and worked through over as much time as it needs. The notion of the flaneur, that is the idea of looking at the activity of the sovereign spectator going about the city in order to find the things which will occupy his or her gaze and thus complete the incomplete identity, is important. And this is a quote from a writer who is interested in understanding the notion of the flaneur in today's society. I believe we are coming out of not only being the anonymous observer and the idea of what we want to do in our realization of the new world, that we do not know what is next, that many of the informants have reiterated this, and yet at the same time, our climate is making up an environment that is providing both a generative period in this advanced phase of the pandemic, where our behaviors on the streets, between the clusters and the lines of the social spaces remade, are born out of the rediscovery of ourselves within open streets and sidewalks. And I believe that these are spaces, are the open vessels of potential that have begun to be filled and to become meaningful spaces and places. A collective is formed that we can engage in alone and with others. Will it remain? The overwhelming request by all I have spoken with, the walker, the recliner, the cyclist, reader, owner, worker, eater, sitter, player, the child, the grown-up, everyone wants this to continue. Politics has entered the conversation. The experience that's needed, though, is for people to work through their bodies, their eyes, and through their hope. Thankfulness is evident. Equity and fair share is important. People say they are willing to pay for what has been free. My hope as a designer and teacher, as well as participant in these ad hoc and episodically designed spaces and places, is that there is a way to remain authentic. I know the word is often eschewed, but what I mean is that there is a hope that is not gentrified and not a touristic one that is about survival, that is collective and a way to revision. I'm hoping that this is not just an untemporary period, but a temporary period that does not turn into a street fair or a pop-up concept that is branded. I think that we have the right to continue this inconsistency, and that we are not seeking for nostalgia of the past, but that we are looking in this way and feeling in this way to continue to work to allow our surprise and our ability to stay happily blurred and dynamic, which is the best of urban life. Thank you.